Good mornings. This morning, once a month, we're going to look at something we call providence in American history. God's dealing with our history and the miracles that have happened through the years. And I wanted just to say that America is a different country, and I mean that in the best possible way, different than any nation on earth. And I would insist that is because America was founded differently. And America is unusually blessed, I believe, more than any nation on earth. And there's a reason for that. And I hope that in talking about these things, it helps us, maybe renews our appreciation for the country that we have, the country that God's given to us. And, and I would say this, it's easy to get discouraged as Christians about what's going on around us as the culture changes, as the culture gets away from God. But I would say that even sometimes these stories, of course, might help us think that America is worth saving. America's worth salvaging. We've been in bad straits in our past, and God has seen fit to bring her back. And let's keep that in mind as we think about the dark days that we're in. It's easy to think that, and we all as Christians, go through that as we look at what's happening to our beloved nation. But last month we looked at a miracle that I call the miracle of the summer fog, and we looked at Washington's escape, the Army's escape from the British as they began to take New York, and this is during the Revolutionary War, and how God changed the weather, brought in a summer fog, and thousands of men were able to be ferried across the East River, and they would have been slaughtered. Their backs were against the river, and God saw fit to save the Army at that point, and now we're 3 or 4 months past that, and the British forces, since that time, that was a wonderful victory and a great miracle. But now the British have won over and over again. Washington has lost New York at this point. Manhattan, Long Island, and Brooklyn have fallen to the British. He realizes that the British's next move is to move on the capital of the revolution, Philadelphia. And so he rushes his troops across New Jersey to try to beat him to Philadelphia, try to save Philadelphia. Cornwallis and Howe, the British generals, follow with 10,000 troops, and they are confident they will catch Washington and destroy the troops. The weather turns very bad. This is the end of the year now. It's 1776. Washington's troops are starving, they're freezing. He is losing troops every day to death and to desertion. They finally reach the Delaware River, and they cross into Pennsylvania, and he turns his troops around to face the British. He orders all boats except the ones that they need to get across the river destroyed at that point, so the British can't follow in boats. So it's interesting, though, at that point, the General Howe, the British general, he decides that he won't take the field in the dead of winter, and that he decides to wait until spring and better weather to finish off the colonists and their dying army. And I think he's thinking, why bother? In the spring, half of them won't be there. They'll be dead or deserted, and it'll be a much easier fight. And so the river freezes over. Huge chunks of ice on the Delaware River clog the entire river. And so 1776 is coming to a close. This is the year that the Declaration is written, and a lot of high hopes. The hopes go across the colonies as people get their hopes up, but 1776 was a terrible year for the Army, and really a year of great suffering and even humiliation. It's drawing to a close, and the American cause seems doomed, frankly. The revolution was crumbling, and Washington himself was in a desperate situation. He writes to his brother John, and he says, "I think the game is pretty near up. You can form no idea of the perplexity of the situation. No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties and less means to extricate himself from them." He's discouraged. He's a human, and he's almost just doesn't know what to do. Thomas Paine, if you remember that name, Thomas Paine is a writer, a thinker, and he had written a very popular pamphlet that had swept across the colonies called Common Sense. And he had joined Washington's armies as a recruit. And during the retreat across New Jersey, he wrote another very powerful essay called The American Crisis. And Washington was so impressed with it that he ordered it to be read to all the troops. And one of the most famous paragraph from that is something you'll recognize, says, "These are times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in the crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the greater the triumph." And Washington, though, is a very human leader, and as I said, and he isn't sure what to do, and he prays for wisdom. A couple of years later, a Presbyterian minister, wrote this in his own handwriting. His name was Nathaniel Snowden. He kept record of much of what happened during the war and the formation of the country. And he tells of this account in his own handwriting. He was visiting with a Pennsylvania state senator, Senator Potts, and Potts recounted this story that I want to read to you. He said Potts was a senator and of course a strong patriot. And the pastor, Nathaniel Snowden, said to Potts, he said, "I was agreeably surprised to find you a friend to your country, as the Quakers," and Potts was a Quaker, "were mostly Tories." And to define the terms Tories, Tory is a name that means a British sympathizer. Of course, at that point, we're all British citizens, but the Tories would be that party and that group of people that sided with the British. So people that lived in America that sided with the British. And he said, I thought you were a Quaker and most of the Quakers were Tories. And he said, "It was so. I was a rank Tory once, for I never believed that America could proceed against Great Britain, whose fleets and armies covered the land and the ocean. But something very extraordinary converted me to be a patriot." "What was that?" I inquired. He said, he was about his farm where the army lay during the War of the Revolution. He said, "Do you see those woods and that plain? It was about a quarter of a mile off from the place we were riding." They were riding together. As it happened, he said, "There lay the army of Washington. It was the most distressing time of the war, and all were for giving up the ship, but that great and good man. In that woods, I heard a plaintive sound as if it was a man at prayer. I tied my horse to a sapling, and I went quietly into the woods, and to my astonishment, I saw the great George Washington on his knees alone, with his sword on one side and his cocked hat on the other. He was at prayer to the God of the armies, beseeching to interpose with his divine aid, as if it was the crisis and cause of the country and humanity and of the world. He said, such a prayer I never heard from the lips of man, and I left him alone praying. I went home and told my wife, I saw a sight and heard today what I never saw or heard before, and just related to her what I had seen and heard and observed. We never thought a man could be a soldier and a Christian, but if there was one in the world, it is Washington. She was also astonished. We thought it was the cause of God and America could prevail. He said, he turned to me and he said, I turned right about and became a patriot. And so here the Army is encamped in Pennsylvania on the Delaware River. Across the river is the mighty army of the British, and right in front of them, closer to the river in Trenton, New Jersey, is our 1,400 battle-hardened German troops that the British had hired mercenaries to fight with them, called the Hessians, they're known as. And Washington looked over that river, frozen almost solid with ice. His men wounded, no coats, just amazing, the desolation, freezing and hungry. He had to do something. So he called his staff together, and he told them he decided to make a bold move and go on the offensive. He thought he would cross into New Jersey late on Christmas night and attack Trenton, where he knew the Hessians would be celebrating Christmas and would probably mostly be drunk. And they would never expect the Americans to come at them on what was really a kind of a holy day. And so later in the day, they began to move the troops. And again, we see God using weather to cover them. A violent snowstorm erupts across that whole area, which makes their march and the crossing almost impossible. But it also, later they realized, reduced the visibility to almost zero, so the enemy couldn't see either. And they had to carefully load the boats with horses and cannon. Complete silence was demanded. Can you imagine moving thousands of troops and no one is allowed to talk? And you got to keep those horses quiet. And another thing about horses and putting them on rafts is one horse out of control can dump the whole raft and kill immediately all the people in it. And so they loaded those thousands of troops. The river was basically an ice flow with huge chunks of ice. And the same fishermen that had helped them ferry the troops across the East River 3 months earlier helped them get across to the Jersey shore. They were there by 3 a.m. in the morning. And already 3 hours behind schedule because he wanted to get there before daylight for the surprise, but he was behind schedule. Washington begins to march to Trenton. One American officer wrote this. He said, "It would be a terrible night for the men who have no shoes. Some of them have old rags around their feet. Others are barefoot. But I have not heard a man complain." Later, someone said, "You could follow the trail the soldiers marched by the blood from their bleeding feet and the snow and the ice." And we'll pick it up there next week. See what happens and how God blesses in this really wonderful story, miracle in our history, and one we want to thank God for. We'll talk about that next week.